Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of Seed Speaks. My name is Alex Martin, and I serve as the editor of Seed World magazine. And today I'm absolutely thrilled to be your host. Today, we're going to be joined by four panelists to talk about a fairly difficult subject, employee retention during mergers and acquisitions. It's a difficult topic because, of course, change is one of the hardest things for a business to overcome. But we have a lovely slew of speakers who are going to help us overcome that fear of change and work to embrace it instead. Um, and with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. We have two speakers that are working to join us at a later time, but for right now, I'm joined today by Dr. Scott Downey, Director of the Center for Food and Agricultural Business at Purdue University, and Blake Krogert, Director of Verdant Partners. Our other two speakers joining us later will be Jonathan Schaefer, owner of Envision Partners, and Courtney White, head of HR for BASF Agricultural Solutions. So we're just waiting for them to join us. But until then, Blake and Scott are going to get us going. Blake and Scott, since y'all are both online with us, I'd like to start with a small, short introduction. So I'll start with Scott and then move on to Blake. But Dr. Scott, how about you go ahead and give us a short introduction of yourself and Purdue and what it is you do?
Sure, I'm happy to, Alex. Hello, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I am director of the Center for Food and Agricultural Business at Purdue University and professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics, where I teach and coordinate our sales and marketing degree program.
Great, thank you. And Blake, same question to you. We're going to work on seeing if you can introduce yourself as well, and then we'll move on to Courtney. Thanks for joining us, Courtney.
Great. Thanks, Alex, and thank you for having us here. Blake Krogert, I'm a director at Verdant Partners in Champaign, Illinois. We are an M&A advisory firm focused on the global food and agriculture industry.
Perfect. And Courtney, why don't you introduce yourself to us as well?
Thank you, Alex. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
I can, yes.
All right. I tell you, I'm still learning along the way, but Courtney White, I am the head of human resources for BASF Agricultural Solutions, responsible for North America, our global seeds and traits business as well. Happy to be here, and hopefully everyone knows BASF.
Perfect. Well, thank you three. And we're just waiting for Jonathan. So once he gets on, he'll join the conversation with us too. But let's go ahead and dive in. So in the meantime, Scott, our first question is directed to you. Scott, I'm sure in your time at Purdue, you have seen and heard a lot about mergers and acquisitions throughout agriculture. What have you heard as being the biggest concern from employees during a transitionary time like this?
It's a personal issue for me as well. I'm in my second career. I was a banker for 15 years before I came into academia during a time when there were a large number of mergers. So I have been through 14 of them in my own career. That's how busy the merger time was. One of the things that I think is most on people's minds as they're going through this time when there are more mergers is how, will I be okay? And I think that's the main thing that employees take away out of this is a desire to have knowledge about what's happening, to know that they're going to be okay, and frequently also to make sure that their customers are going to be okay. I work closely in the sales area, and it's often one of the major concerns salespeople have.
No, that makes a lot of sense, Scott. That making sure that everyone's going to be okay is important. So our second question is for Blake. Very similar question, but I wanted to ask you, Blake, from the exact opposite end. do you hear any concern about employee retention from owners conducting the mergers and acquisitions at the time? What's kind of the top of mind for them, Blake?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alex, and actually Scott's lead in is perfect because the two are very much related, in my opinion. Employee retention is a critical facet with any transaction, and keeping in mind what Scott said, employees are the lifeblood of organizations, and ensuring that retention is adequate is only going to result in the business that's being acquired getting to its full worth and potential. So it's critical, really, that buyers understand the capabilities of the team that's transitioning, the skills that are there, and successfully integrate those into the acquired selling entity. Separately, I think a concern and a potential problem that we see in transitions is different benefits, compensation structures, cultures between similar employment roles, and that's certainly unique to each transaction. But buyers need to carefully assess, and as do sellers, mitigate any potential problems that can result in dissatisfaction of an employee, either on the buying or selling side, to ensure the transaction strategy is fulfilled.
Great. Thank you so much, Blake. That does make a lot of sense too. I'd like now to ask a question to Jonathan, which if you would see, we have now had him join us. So Jonathan, first, I'd like you to do a brief introduction of yourself, but then I want you to answer the question. Since you were from a bit of the different side of scientists and plant breeders, what's the best piece of advice you've given these more scientifically driven employees dealing with a merger or acquisition? Well, and it looks like Jonathan might be having some technical issues. So I'll go ahead and go to our next question, Courtney, so we can keep going. So Courtney, you've gotten to go through yourself an acquisition of different Bayer assets into BASF, ranging from their vegetable seed company to their cotton seed brand to the canola seed to soybean seed brands. So in your opinion, what were some of the steps that BASF took to kind of smooth out that transition?
Thank you for the question, Alex. I mean, there were several steps, but maybe what I'll do is highlight three. And pardon the sports analogy, but what we learned is what is proven true time and time again. The best way to prepare to win the game is based on the practice drills you run during the pregame practice sessions. And so step one, I would refer to as collaboration, defining a mutual approach, goals, objectives, as well as determining who really need to be a part of the collaboration from both organizations. Our goal was to plan and prioritize what needed to happen immediately versus what could be delayed. Often people think everything has to happen right away or at the same speed, and that's simply not the case. It's always going to be a journey. The next step that I'd like to mention is communicate. It was vitally important to ensure we kept an appropriate cadence of meetings on the calendar across multiple levels to ensure we remained on the same page, as well as understood the statuses of where we were. Beyond the project team, however, it was equally important to keep all of our prospective new joiners and current employees up to date in order to manage expectations. You learn over the years that in absence of sharing information, sometimes, people generate their own narrative. And I should note, this communication should and has to be two-way. And then the third step that I will mention for the sake of this conversation is commitment. Everyone has to ensure they understand their role in this change management journey. We have to acknowledge the realities, acknowledge the journey, and seek commitment from everyone. A way to do this for us was to ensure that all decisions weren't made by the project teams. To the degree possible, we desired to have shared decision-making. Shared decision-making often helps people manage, negative response or what could have been negative response to change because they are participating in the story rather than just being targeted readers. Thanks.
No, that is perfect, Courtney. I'm really glad you brought up this idea of communication, Courtney, because I feel like that's one of the most important spots to talk about, and it leads really well into my next question for Scott, which is, Scott, I feel like half of the battle after a merger is trying to explain to employees why this change occurred. So what do you usually recommend to those leaders in charge of acquisitions during these times? How do you tell them to coach to their employees why this change is happening?
Yeah, so I think it's a really important point, and that was a terrific, Courtney, summary of those three C's through that process. But I think for leaders in particular, and I started out saying I think people care and worry about their own lot in life and their customers. And I think so for leaders, explaining the why can't just be the why we did it as a company. I think that focus also has to be on how it benefits customers, what the impacts are going to be to employees. People care more about their own whys than they do others. And we tend to, I think, overvalue explanations when explanations always rarely do justice to the complexity of decisions that are made. That said, there are employees who certainly worry particularly if they're on the acquiree side of that equation, that there was something they did that led to that from a negative perspective, and that's almost never the case. But so some assurance about that, I think, is an important part of that explanation of the why, and talking about where things are headed. So I think for leaders, the message is keep it simple, be direct, certainly be truthful and honest. There's always challenges because leaders often know things that aren't wise or legal to publicly disclose, but be focused on others. So empathy is the driving force for that.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, that keeping empathy in mind during this time kind of helps. To go along with that kind of idea, Blake, my next question is for you. How should leaders work to keep their employees engaged during this merger or acquisition? And maybe as well, what should they avoid doing?
Yeah, it's another good question, Alex. And Courtney and Scott, both segues are excellent there. I think, when it comes to the question about keeping employees engaged, it's a difficult balance in a lot of ways. But to Courtney's sports analysis, you're asking somebody not to just play offense and do their regular task, but now all of a sudden they have to play defense too. Employees are going to be doing their daily tasks, items, but then have to spend significant amount of time working on a transaction being put together. And they'll have to go above and beyond what their normal to-dos are. The one way I think that we see a lot in transactions, and depending on the personnel and what their level is, and certainly on the transaction structure, is creating incentives for key employees to potentially be rewarded for the extra effort that goes into a transaction. I think the other point is on communication, to Scott's, certainly emphasizing to employees the future value of working with that potential acquirer needs to be stated early and often. But the balance of when, again, back to Scott's point, is the most difficult. Confidentiality is certainly a concern on who is able to be made aware from an employee standpoint of a transaction process, as well as when. So balancing, I think, the need to know who needs to know and when they need to know, and effectively communicating the process with those individuals is a really important item, and it's unique to each and individual transaction, but needs to be handled very carefully between buyer and seller.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Blake. We actually just got in an audience question. If y'all wouldn't mind taking a stab at it, I'm going to leave this open to whichever three would like to answer of you. It's from Ashley Robinson. She asks, how, as an employee, should you handle your day-to-day work during a merger?
I'll jump in there real quickly. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's also emblematic of what I've been saying. As you know, it's about how does it impact me, and of course, it depends on what your role is as an employee. But there are, I think, that there's a tendency to for us to use informal communication frequently when we're not in a leadership role through the merger. And by that, I mean it's awfully easy to kind of get sucked into the unofficial stories. I'll call it gossip about what's going to be happening. And I think rarely does that, do those gossip mills actually hold very much value ever, but certainly during a merger, I think there's a lot of that. So, you know, how do you as an employee handle this? Number one, stay positive. Things are outside of your control, and that's disconcerting for all of us. But one of the best ways to deal with that is to try to stay positive, not just for yourself, but for your customers and your colleagues who are also experiencing these same things. So sometimes to help ourselves, it's easier to help others. And so stay positive in that way, I think, is useful.
Yeah, Scott, just to add to that, I think it's a perfect point. We often advise our clients and not just employees on transaction processes to continue the status quo, which is an impossible thing to do considering all the noise that's going on. But you must operate as if the transaction weren't happening and you're still pursuing business leads and what's in the best interest of the company if in the inevitable event the transaction doesn't go forward. And I think that holds true to employees in their individual roles as well.
Of course. Courtney, what would you like to add?
You know, it's interesting, and maybe the one build, because I agree with what's been stated. You know, this happened earlier in my career. And, you know, I without knowing, maybe at that point, I took the advice that was just given and continued the status quo. And I remembered being visited by my colleagues every day asking, was I okay? Did you not hear the news, Courtney? There's going to be a merger, and they expected me to either relax or, you know, start doing something different. But my goal at the time was, you know, I'm still being, you know, paid to do a job, and I need to, you know, keep focused on that until someone says otherwise. And actually, it turned out the exact way as what was outlined. That was the best thing to do. So I wholeheartedly agree with that. And the one thing I will say is, you know, your responsibility to yourself and your family, from my perspective, is the same, whether a merger or acquisition is going on or not. And that is to always do what's best for you all and in your best interest. And hopefully it's always to remain focused and stay with the organization. But I would say that's not necessarily the factor. Just always be aware of what's going on to the degree possible. Thanks.
Perfect. Well, you three, I think, led into our next audience question from Sonia Lane very well. I'm going to start by directing this to Courtney, because I feel like since this has happened so recently to you, you can talk to it. How do you maintain and or boost that employee morale when there could be staffing cuts after a merger? Courtney, you just mentioned that people were walking around asking you, you know, are you okay, and things like that. How do you keep up that morale during, I hate using this because I feel like we hear it all the time during the pandemic, but a time of uncertainty?
It's a great question. You know, respectfully, I think Scott said it well too. It is really about understanding, you know, what's in your control, what's in your influence, and what's outside of it, and navigating it. Now, I say that more simple than it is to do quite often, but it is something that you learn more and more over time. This is why change management is such an important competency, capability, and focal point in organizations, because what everyone would love to be able to say is that nothing will change, things will stay the same. But we also know that that's not the recipe for growth, that's not the recipe for business, and that's not going to happen. And so the thing that does have to happen is we have to figure out how we manage ourselves through it, how we respond to it. And as we continue to learn that, then quite honestly, I think you begin to determine, what are your coping mechanisms, where ultimately the goal is to do what was already stated by other colleagues on the call. Stay positive, stay focused. And again, remember that while it's not all about you, it's still about you. Thank you.
Perfect. Scott or Blake, do y'all want to chime in on it anymore, or do you feel like it's all been said then?
No, I think Courtney really well said. Maybe the only addition, and just to emphasize it, is controlling the controllables in a lot of ways. There are things that you can keep within your court and others that are outside your control, but ensure your best likelihood and outcome depending on what's in your control.
The only thing I would add is as a leader through these types of situations, I think it's really important to be clear about your messaging internally and externally, and it's not new news, but the rule of threes works pretty well, and identify, what are those three things that can be our rallying cry when people around you are losing their positions, friends are losing their positions. It's tough, and it's a good time to make sure that we're clear about what we're about. How are we going to continue to work together? And I think that's kind of we're in this together is one of the key factors in those times after there's been changes to the employment level in an organization.
That's perfect. Thank you, you three. Getting back into it, one thing I think we've kind of touched on a little bit but haven't really dove into is this idea of of company culture. So Scott, this question I had directed to you. How does how does company culture factor into mergers and acquisitions and employee retention? For example, is it difficult to take one separate work culture and another and combine it into one perfectly new one?
I think because culture is one of those squishy words, it's easy to ignore it. And so it might be useful to kind of think through, what do we mean by that culture? And I like to think of culture as kind of the unwritten rules that we all follow. Policy is written rules, obviously. Culture are the ways that we treat each other, the ways we've always done things. But anybody who's really interested in digging into this culture topic, I would encourage you to Google the words cultural artifacts, because there's a lot of ways that culture is exemplified or that comes out within a company. And it's not oftentimes culture is not just the big things, it's little things. So I'll give an example that one of the companies that when I was in banking, I was in a company that, they always call it the merger of equals, but it was not the merger of equals. Our company was clearly the lesser of the equals. And the company that I worked for had always celebrated the holidays in a pretty big way. So at Thanksgiving of every year, the leaders of the company went to every location and brought everybody, every employee, a big old turkey before Thanksgiving, like the Monday before Thanksgiving, and shook everybody's hand and thanked them. Well, the merger closed in July and everything stayed the same till October. But the new company was clearly in charge by November, and the week of Thanksgiving came and there were no turkeys. And boy, you would have thought the sky had fallen because there weren't any turkeys. And, the new company just didn't realize that that was an important part of the old culture. So So the next Monday they tried to make it right, and they sent everybody a coupon for a free turkey at Christmas. They didn't quite get it right though, because the grocery store that you could go to get it was only at the corporate headquarters of the new company. And so it's easy to stumble on the culture issue. And so the idea is be aware of what those traditions are, and try to engage with them. But it's also things like, how do we treat company logos? What do we allow company logos to be on? When is it okay to wear clothing that has those logos on it? So it's a lot of little things that make up culture. But talking to some of the people who've been around so that you can understand what somebody else's culture like is always a key to bringing cultures together.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. I think we have enough time for 2 last questions, one for Blake and one for Courtney. So Blake, similar kind of question. I wanted to take another stab at culture while we're still here. Like Scott mentioned, it's easy to stumble and it's easy to miss what might be important to one group of employees versus what's important to another group. What do you recommend when it comes to company cultures?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I might echo a lot of what Scott said, but to me, there's maybe a breakdown of two different items. I think one is more large strategy culture between buyer and seller, the two companies that are coming together. And those are often things that, in our opinion, should be done prior to the transaction process really getting underway. Pre-diligence by companies to ensure that the culture of either the acquired or selling company lines up with that of the other party. When you get into the smaller, more, I don't mean to say smaller, but some of the additional items that Scott mentioned, like turkeys, for example, those are things that only can be solved with open communication. And that happens throughout the process. And people need to be doing an effective job of communicating with one another. What are those things that are clearly important to the employees that are coming into a new organization? How do we utilize, ensure that those are continued, but also maybe even leverage some of those to improve our own company culture and employment dealings? So two different areas, in my opinion, but all of them function and factor around good communication.
Perfect. And then Courtney, final question coming to you. It's all about communication still as well. We haven't gotten to talk about this yet, I don't think. So since we've already kind of talked about the transition, how important it is to take in company culture and things like that, how important was it for you at BASF and the staff at BASF to make sure everyone understood the big picture of BASF during this transition?
It's a great question, and I think other colleagues too on the call have talked about it in different ways. Where ultimately, I would say it was immensely important to ensure that everyone understands the big picture. From my perspective, it's a question of the value proposition. During a merger of acquisition, as what was stated, employees often feel that it's happening to them rather than with them or even for them. And so our goal was to ensure that everyone embraced versus tolerated the transition to BASF. It becomes a factor of engagement because, we need everyone to understand the big picture and how they fit into it. That's how we also tap into the discretionary effort that our organizations count on to fuel the innovation that keeps us moving forward. Truthfully, this was easy for us to do because our big picture got even stronger with the acquisition, and we wouldn't have been able to say so without the colleagues who were joining us. So the big picture, hugely important.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, you three. I think that's all the time we have for today. So I want to give a big thank you to our audience for participating, and to Scott, Courtney, and Blake for joining us. And a big thank you to Jonathan as well. Even though he had technical issues, he was still here on the planning side with us, and we'll make sure to get his comments for you all, so you won't miss Jonathan's portion of this live either. And just a reminder, if you missed any portion of this live, we'll be putting up the recording on seedworld.com later this week, along with an article. And if you liked this topic, make sure you tune in next week to hear Germination editor Mark Sienkiewicz talk about work safety in the lab during COVID-19, as well as how to develop a plan for employees to do safe lab work and facility inspections. It'll be a great topic. It'll be really informative, and I'm looking forward to it next week. So we hope to see you all next week. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.